In 2008, Joe served in Afghanistan with the U.S. Army Special Forces. One day, as he drove along a narrow dirt road near an embankment, disaster struck. He and 3 others were in an armored vehicle when the ground beneath them gave way, sending the massive vehicle sliding sideways toward the icy water below. Now years later, he was back in that terrifying moment, reliving the horror. Suddenly, a rattle at the gate shook him from his waking nightmare. Joe looked up to see Judge Lou standing there. Back in 2008, Joe and 3 other men were strapped into the armored truck with doors so heavy they needed a hydraulic system just to open them. They were driving down a dirt track beside a canal when the road suddenly disappeared beneath them. The truck toppled over, careening down the bank, rolling into the water and submerging them, leaving everyone gasping for air. The water started rising up to my head, Joe remembers. I was struggling to get my seatbelt off. His friend jumped back and yanked him up, allowing him to breathe, but they were trapped. The hydraulic system was knocked out, and they were desperately fighting to open the doors. You couldn't see the water rising because it was pitch black, but you could feel it, Joe recalls. Soon the water reached their chins. In a daze, Joe heard a gurgling sound and realized, horrified, that a load of gas bottles they were carrying had been crushed in the truck. The gas was leaking into the water, quickly filling the pockets of air that were keeping Joe alive. He drifted in and out of consciousness, unsure of how long he'd been trapped. During moments of lucidity, he later described how his mind played tricks on him amid the wreckage. I saw things that weren't there. I was hallucinating, he says. I thought I had died. It felt like an eternity before help finally arrived. His team found the truck, and Joe woke to someone tugging at him, trying to free him from the wreckage. Leaning heavily on his rescuers, Joe struggled up the embankment, slow and disoriented. Looking back at the truck, he saw a sight that would haunt him forever. 3 of his teammates lay motionless. Joe was the sole survivor. It crushed me, he says. He lost more than just his team that night. Years later, even after his military service had ended, Joe suffered flashbacks. The night in the truck would return to him unexpectedly. A whiff of fuel or small enclosed spaces could trigger nightmares and overwhelming anxiety. He could never bring himself to speak about the team members he lost that night. Like many veterans, Joe found it difficult to adjust back to civilian life. No one could understand what he had been through, no matter how much he tried to explain. To numb the pain, he began drinking, turning to beer as a temporary escape from his post-traumatic stress. I didn't drink because I liked the taste, he says. It was when I was angry or hurting. His drinking led to trouble at home and eventually resulted in a DUI. He was placed on probation, with frequent court appearances and required sobriety tests. But Joe couldn't give up drinking and ended up falsifying one of his later tests. 2 weeks after lying to the court, he confessed to the judge. Joe apologized, but a simple apology wasn't enough. Judge Lou Oliveira, who presided over his case, believed Joe needed to be held accountable for his actions, so he sentenced Joe to a night in prison. Unknown to Joe, Judge Lou was also an Army veteran and understood the struggles Joe was facing. Yet here he was, sending Joe to spend 12 hours alone in a dark cell, reliving the nightmare. But Judge Lou was not a cruel man. He knew Joe would suffer from the isolation, so he came up with a radical plan. On the day Joe was to report to jail, Judge Lou decided to meet him there, mostly to offer reassurance. When he showed up, I could tell he was visibly distressed, Lou remembers. He was shaking, trembling, and sweating, and this was even before Joe had entered the cell. What would happen when those doors closed behind him, locking him in for the night? The walls seemed to press in on him. If Joe stretched his arms out, he could touch both walls on either side. It felt as though the cold, dark cell was shrinking around him, just like the immovable doors of the truck had been the night of the accident. Suddenly, he was back in the truck, cold water rising to his chin, the smell of gas thick in the air, and no way out. The flashback wouldn't stop. I put my hands over my head and looked down, trying to think of being anywhere but here, he recalls. But it was impossible. His skin crawled and cold sweat covered his body. The gate swung shut behind him, echoing in his mind. I was so nervous, Joe says. A sudden rattle at the gate jolted him out of his waking nightmare. Joe looked up, knowing his time was far from over, but praying that by some miracle he could just walk out that door. Instead, he saw Judge Lou. The judge smiled at Joe, and Joe managed a slight smile in return. There stood Judge Lou Oliveira, smiling and holding a tray of food. He came in and sat down on the bed, saying, "Scoot over." Joe looked at him, confused. "What's up? You bringing me some food now, Judge?" The judge replied, "Nope, I'm staying here." Joe was taken aback. "You're staying? Where?" "In this cell with you," Lou responded. "You're going to stay here with me the entire time." "That's what we're going to do," Lou confirmed. Joe was flabbergasted by the idea but couldn't say no. This was completely unprecedented. Lou had never spent a night in jail, let alone with a prisoner. But after seeing Joe's distress, he knew he had to help somehow. "I called my wife," Lou recalls. "I said, 'Honey, I'm not coming home for dinner.' 'Why not?' she asked. 'Well, I'm going to jail.' I'm sure she was pretty stunned too." Lou's presence had an immediate effect on Joe. "It automatically made me feel like a person again," Joe says. "I was overwhelmed. I really wanted to cry, but I didn't feel alone." Sitting side by side in the cell, judge and veteran shared meatloaf and mashed potatoes, talking about their families, jobs, television, and the war. Around midnight, Lou put a mat on the ground. "I said, 'Judge, if anything, please take the bunk. Let me sleep on the ground.'" Joe recalls, but Lou insisted. "I got it," he said. They chatted in the dark until Joe's breathing grew heavier, and he eventually began to snore. "That's when I felt relieved," Lou says, "because I knew Joe was going to be okay." The next morning, Lou drove Joe home before returning to the courthouse. "Walking out of that cell felt like a clean slate," Joe recalls. "I asked one of the jailers, 'Have you ever seen that before?' He replied, 'No, don't disappoint him.'" For Joe, one of the hardest parts of living with PTSD had been learning to trust people again. "I'd stopped trusting anyone," he admits. But Lou changed that. Just having him there shifted my entire mindset. When he walked in, it broke down the walls and gave me a new confidence, a renewed faith in trusting people. What do you think of this incident? Let us know in the comments section. I hope you liked this video. Please give it a thumbs up and share it with your loved ones. Also subscribe and press the bell icon to never miss the update from our channel. Thank you.